Happy Monday, April 13th, everybody. Welcome to Eating in the Kitchen, our version of the Daily Special. Thank you guys for taking some time out of your day to join us today. Today we have RDT and Doug Reisner presenting today. RDT, Refrigerated Design Technologies, is based out of, help me out here, Doug, Waxahachie, Texas. There you go. Which is about an hour south of Dallas, correct?
About 40 minutes.
Okay. If I'm driving, it's an hour. So, but it is just south of Dallas in Texas. Today, like I said, Doug Reisner is our presenter. He's from Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And if you know where that is, that's 30 miles north of Philly. So he's probably a Philly fan, which is okay for some, not with others. But Doug, I appreciate you taking part in this today, and it's all yours.
I mean, thank you.
Yep.
I'm going to try to make this a crash course. I've got a full PowerPoint here, but I'm going to skip through a lot of it because I think there's some things we just don't have to worry about. I want to get to the meat of it, if you will. First of all, let's start with saying that RDT can design refrigeration for almost any scenario. If you have a refrigeration need, just send it in to us. Let us review the drawing, the specs, and so on. And if we can't do it, we'll certainly let you know. But I've been around about 3.5 years, and I've yet to see anything that we really can't do. So let's just start with that. Secondly, I want to start with this particular slide because when I travel around and meet with consultants and dealers, design, build, and so on, a lot of times I hear that, well, rack systems are for the larger jobs. Well, that's not true. A rack can start at a cooler freezer combo and go up from there. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner of your screen where it says RDT, that's our mini rack. It's not a big rack, it's a mini rack, but that could be like a combo box, a cooler freezer. What you're seeing in the upper right-hand corner of your screen is what you would get from the walk-in manufacturers. And many times I'll ask, okay, when it comes to refrigeration, okay, what are you doing? What are you using? And I'll find that some people are using racks, on the larger jobs. And I'll say, well, what are you doing on the smaller jobs? Your cooler freezer, cooler beer cooler freezer, whatever. We just get it from the walk-in guys. Okay. Well, hopefully I'm going to show you the reason not to just get it from the walk-in guys. The upper right-hand corner is what you're getting from the walk-in guys. Very basic, mass-produced price unit. Powder-coated exterior. It's got a 20-gauge base on it. They put a little grate in the back to keep the squirrels and the debris out of it. The components are down and dirty, usually hermetic compressors. Do they work? Yeah. They've been out there for a long time, and they're going to continue to be out there for a long time. The problem is, though, how long do they really last? Let's talk about the pricing first before I get into the differences. Last time I looked at pricing, the pricing differences between the two. In the upper right-hand corner says not RDT. That comes from your walk-in guys. That's a cooler freezer unit along with the evaporator coils. Was about $10,000, give or take a couple dollars. In the upper left-hand corner with RDT, it was about $11,500, $11,600. So it was about 15 to 16% more than you're paying, in the upper right-hand corner. However, when you put these things up on a roof, unlike many, many years ago, you just can't throw a couple pressure-treated 4x4s on the roof anymore, set these on top and be done with it. Excuse me. You've got to have a curb made. And those curbs cost money, anywhere from $500 to $1,500. I'm sorry, depending on who's doing it. The second problem is, or second thing you need to take into consideration is the electronic hookup. In the upper left-hand corner, you've got one electrical connection. In the upper right-hand corner, you've got two electrical connections, and those electrical connections, again, can cost anywhere from $800 to $1,800 per electrical connection. So by the time you figure the additional installation costs in the upper right-hand corner, you've eaten away that 15 or 16 percentage points difference in pricing. And now what you're going to get is something a lot better than you would be getting from the walk-in guys. What you're getting from the walk-in guy is a basic unit, like I said. It has no fan guard. It's got a basic sleeve bearing condenser motor. It's got a 20 gauge base. All the wiring is exposed. It's still using copper cap tubing, and it gives you a condenser for 95-degree ambient temperature. Now, when you give us a request for a quote or design and end quote, we ask you one question for two reasons. That question is, where is it going? And the first reason we ask you that question is, we want to make sure that we're going to give you something that's going to operate in the ambient temperature conditions as to where it's going. If you're sending it up into where I live, up in the Northeast or the upper Midwest, where it's cold most of the time or reasonable most of the time, something like this would probably do fine. 95-degree ambient temperature is about as high as you're going to get on most days. However, if this is going into parts of South Florida, South Texas, South Arizona, in the desert, this 95-degree ambient condenser on this particular system is not going to work. Sometimes the ambient temperatures out there can be 110, 115, 120 degrees. And all you need is a couple of days like that, and a system like this is going to break down very quickly. So what we will do is we will build a condenser that will handle the ambient temperature, because everything we build is custom. We build everything to order. It's not mass produced and sitting on a shelf somewhere. The second reason for that question is, how close to any salt water is it going to be? If the system is going to be set up outdoors within 20 miles to salt water, we want to make sure we coat the condenser the condenser coil, to make sure that it's not going to be eaten away by salt air. A condenser coil is made up of copper and aluminum fins, copper tubing with aluminum fins. Those aluminum fins can get eaten away very quickly within a couple of years by salt air. And if you don't coat those fins, you may not get the phone call, maybe they'll forget about it, but you could get the phone call that the thing is broken down, it's been eaten away, and you need a new one, and they're not going to be very happy with it. So we are going to build a system that's going to work in the environment as to where it's going, okay? So this is what you're getting from them, and this is what you're getting from us. You're going to have a stainless steel exterior with not powder coated. Instead of having a little grate on the back, you're going to have louver panels that keep out the hail and the debris that could be flying against the system from time to time. We're going to oversize the condenser when needed to 110 degrees Fahrenheit to make sure it's going to work. We're going to put a fan guard on there, so when the guys are servicing the unit, if they don't watch what they're doing, that fan's running, they'll take off a finger. God only knows. We've seen it happen, so we put an OSHA-proof fan guard on there. We have a 12-gauge base instead of a 20-gauge base. We're using a ball-bearing motor. And instead of using cap tubing, which is this curly-Q thing, looks like a still, and what that does is that's got refrigerant in it that's measuring the pressure from one side of the system to the other. Instead of using a cap tubing like this that is hard wired, if you will, or hard connected, we're actually using PEX tubing, which is a plastic tubing. It's less likely to leak, less likely to break by using PEX tubing. So pretty much you can see the major differences between what you're getting in the upper right-hand corner and what you're getting in the upper left-hand corner. One curb, one electrical connection, all stainless steel. Of course, I'm biased, but to me, it's kind of a no-brainer to a certain degree. The only difference is you're going to have to write the dealer's going to have to write a separate purchase order, one purchase order from the walk-in boxes, and now one purchase order for the refrigeration. Another thing that we do, I'll go through this quickly, is on the evaporator coils. RDT pre-wires and pre-plumbs all the evaporator coils before we send them out. When you get a system from our competitors and that evaporator coil shows up on site, the installer will mount it in the walk-in box, but then the electrician literally has to go in and literally take off one side of the evaporator coil and run all of his wiring and put it back together again. On the opposite end, the plumber has to literally take off the other side of the evaporator coil, run his liquid and suction line in. They're the lines where the refrigerant goes from the compressor to the evaporator coil, and then the evaporator back to the compressor. They're called liquid and suction lines. They've got to be plumbed in properly. And if they're not done properly, it's going to break down in a very short amount of time. Now, RDT decided to pre-wire and pre-plumb these probably 20 years ago because the installers that were not doing it properly or screwed something up, we were getting the phone call because the only name on that evaporator coil was RDT. So we decided, you know what, we're not going to do this anymore. So now what we do is we pre-wire everything in the evaporator coil on the one side, and we end it in a junction box with an on-off switch. So now all the electrician has to do is open up the junction box, drop in his wiring and hook it up, and he's done. On the opposite end, we stub out the liquid and suction line and we cap it to keep debris from getting in there. So now all the plumber has to do is braze off the caps and braze on the liquid and suction line from the compressor, and you're done. It saves about 40% of the time on the installation of the evaporator coil alone. You will not get that from our competitors or from the walk-in box manufacturers. Okay. Okay, let's get past this a little bit. Let's go to Oh, I'll tell you what. Let's talk about compressors for a while, for a moment. The main compressors you're going to see on the market are semi-hermetic, hermetic, and scrolls. They're the most popular. Actually, the most popular compressor is a scroll. The semi-hermetic is an old-time thing. It's been around forever. The semi-hermetic compressor is the most expensive compressor on the market, and it's very, very heavy. It's heavy duty, works great, but the problem is when they do break down, you just can't disconnect this thing, throw it under your arm and walk it down a ladder and go get another one and bring it back. You actually need a crane. You need a crane to set it into place. You need a crane to hook it back up again. You need a crane to take it down. It's got 16 moving pieces, and it's kind of a relic. They're not used that much anymore. Hermetic compressors are the least expensive compressor on the market. Again, has 16 moving parts. Most of your refrigeration that you have at home and on reach-in refrigerators and under-counter refrigerators, things like that, will be using a hermetic compressor. The problem with a hermetic compressor is you can't have a hermetic compressor any more than 50 feet away from the evaporator coil, or it's going to break down on you. Now let's talk about line runs quickly while we're talking about compressors. When it comes to line runs, the line run meaning the liquid and suction line, the lines that hold the refrigerant from the compressor to the evaporator coil. A line run meaning how far away is the compressor from the evaporator coil? Is it 100 feet? Is it 50 feet? Is it 300 feet away? When you're talking about line runs, the longest line run vertically that you can use or install is 45 to 50 feet. Anything over 45 to 50 feet will make the compressor break down, and I'll tell you why. Compressors need oil to lubricate themselves, and the oil is in the refrigerant. Refrigerant is almost like a compressor is almost like a two-stage lawnmower. That's a lawnmower you may buy where you put the oil in the gasoline, you mix it up, and then you pour that mixture into the gas tank of the two-stage lawnmower. Well, the reason you did that was the oil in the gasoline goes through the engine and it lubricates the engine. Well, a compressor works the same way. When a refrigeration installer installs the refrigeration and charges the lines with the refrigerant, he adds a certain amount of oil into the system. And what that oil does is it mixes with the refrigerant, and as it goes through the system, it's lubricating the compressors. Now, the reason that you can't go any more than 45 or 50 feet vertical on a line run is there's not a compressor on the market. And I don't care who tells you, my competitors will tell you all day long, don't worry about it, no big deal. They'll tell you anything to get a sale. But if you have a compressor more than 50 feet away from the evaporator coil vertically, the oil is not going to get back to the compressor, and it's going to seize up just like an engine, and it's going to break down, and you have to replace it. So now going horizontally, you can certainly go horizontally a couple hundred feet very easily, with the exception of a hermetic compressor. A scroll compressor, a hermetic compressor, a digital scroll, you can certainly go a couple hundred feet horizontal, but you can never ever go more than 45 or 50 feet vertical because the oil is not going to make it back to the compressor. Okay. Now, a hermetic compressor and a semi-hermetic compressor have 16 moving parts, and they work, and they're piston driven. What is a compressor? A compressor is two things. First of all, a compressor is a pump. A compressor pumps the refrigerant around this is the refrigeration cycle. The compressor pumps the refrigeration around in a circle in the refrigeration cycle, number one, okay? Number two is it compresses the refrigerant. When a refrigerant comes out of the evaporator coil, it comes out as a vapor or a gas, if you will. It goes to the compressor. The compressor compresses it down from a low pressure, a low temperature vapor to a high pressure, high temperature vapor and pushes it to the condenser. We'll go back to this in a moment, okay? And the way a semi-hermetic and a hermetic compressor does that is it uses pistons, just like a piston-driven engine. It's got pistons inside that go up and down, okay? Now, if you get any foreign matter in the refrigeration system during the installation or service, meaning that when you have these copper pipes that are, for all intents and purposes, soldered together with like a solder. When the installer is soldering these pipes together, if he gets a piece of solder that stayed inside the piping, inside the pipe itself, and eventually breaks off, that solder could make its way to the compressor. And when it hits the compressor, when those pistons are going up and down doing their job, if that solder happens to hit that piston at the right time, it's going to break down the compressor, and you're going to have to replace it. Number two is if any moisture or liquid gets into the system, that too, once it makes it to the compressor, a piston-driven compressor, if it hits it the right way, it's going to break the piston down because the piston cannot compress that liquid. And there's two liquids that could make it to the compressor. The first way is during installation. If there's a lot of moisture built up in the piping before the installer puts the piping together, number one. And number two is if too much refrigerant, liquid refrigerant goes into the evaporator coil and doesn't actually flash boil and turn into a vapor, you don't want that liquid refrigerant going to the compressor because that liquid too will break down the compressor. So the third compressor is a scroll compressor. And what makes a scroll compressor unique is instead of using piston-driven technology, it uses radial compliance. And basically what radial compliance is this. If you look on the right side of your screen, you'll see that there's a black line going around in a curly Q and a red line going around in a curly Q. Think of these as two pieces of steel that are bent into a curly Q like that, attached to a motor, and the motor is turning these two pieces of steel around in a circle at high speed. That's what's pumping the refrigerant through the system, and that's what's compressing the refrigerant as it goes through the compressor. If you look on the very complete right side of this screen, of this slide rather, you see where the black piece ends, and it's not touching the red piece there, okay? But then if you follow it down, you'll see how it gets closer and closer and closer together, and at the bottom it actually touches. Well, that's how it pumps refrigerant through the system and compresses the refrigerant as well. And the reason I bring this up is scroll compressors are more forgiving than piston-driven compressors. If you get any solid or moisture in between these two pieces of steel, what will happen is most likely is those pieces of steel will separate just enough to allow the whatever got in the system to go through it. So let's say it's that piece of solder, that solid piece of solder that got in the system. What will happen is it'll go between those two pieces of steel. They'll separate just slightly to allow that solder to go into the compressor. And then on the left-hand side, where you see the red arrow, look straight down to the bottom of the compressor. That's where that solid piece of material would likely end up out of the way. And it'll stay there until someday when this compressor needs to be replaced, they'll just replace it with a new one. If it happens to be liquid or moisture that got into the system, again, the same thing would happen. It would go between those two pieces of steel. Those two pieces of steel would separate slightly and allow the moisture to go through the system. Now, on the liquid and suction line, we're not going to get into it today, but there's a dryer, what they call a dryer on the line. And that dryer is there for any liquid that may get into the system from time to time. And what that dryer does is it's got some desiccant in it, and it'll absorb that moisture and keep it from running through the system once again. Okay, so scroll compressors, they're more forgiving. They've only got 3 moving parts, very quiet operation, and they can push refrigerant as far as a semi-hermetic compressor can. And the reason we use it is because it's for all the purposes that I just mentioned, and the pricing on it is right between a semi-hermetic and a hermetic compressor. So they're really not that expensive. And as the time goes on and more of them are being used, the pricing, continues to come down. So I would say 90% of what you get from RDT refrigeration will be scroll compressors. The only time we use other compressors is when we have to do something that is a little more heavy duty, like on a refrigeration for blast chiller, for instance. That has to have on a shock freezer. You've got to have a compressor that can get down to minus 40 degrees. Well, scroll compressor cannot get down to minus 40 degrees yet. So we have to use a special compressor, very similar to a semi-hermetic, to be able to get down to minus 40 degrees. So there's going to be times where we're going to have to use those types of compressors when we can't use a scroll compressor. But for the most part, we're going to be using scroll compressors. And so are my competitors as well. It's a very popular compressor. Let's talk again about the refrigeration cycle quickly. Basically, keep in mind when you're talking about refrigeration, you're not taking cold air or very cold air in a freezer situation and putting it into the walk-in box. What you're doing is you're taking the heat out. And when you take the heat out of an area, what happens is whatever is left behind becomes cold. So in a cooler, you're taking out enough heat to keep it at about 40 degrees. In a freezer, you're taking more heat out to bring it down to minus 10 degrees. So what you're doing is taking the heat out, you're not putting cold in. That's number one. Number two is what you're doing is you're taking the heat from one area and you're sending it to another area to distribute it out into the atmosphere. So in a situation like this, what happens is in the evaporator coil, there's fans on the back of the evaporator coil. And what those fans do is it sucks all the hot air that happens to come into the walk-in box from opening the door and hot food and things like that. It's sucking all that hot air and bringing it up to the evaporator coil. And the reason it's doing that is the refrigerant at that point is, if it's in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see it says low pressure, low temperature liquid. That refrigerant is a very, very cold liquid at that point, and it's being pumped into the evaporator coil by the compressor. Once it gets into the evaporator coil, those fans are blowing that hot air from the walk-in box through the coil, and then the refrigerant is absorbing that heat, and it's flash boiling and turning into a vapor, and it's heading to the compressor. It's almost like take a pot of water and put it on your stove, and as it starts to boil, think of the water as being the refrigerant and the steam coming off of it being the refrigerant after it's flash boiled, after it's absorbed all that heat, okay? So what happens is it turns into a vapor, a low pressure, low temperature vapor. It goes to the compressor, and then the compressor compresses that vapor, and what it does is it kind of compresses that vapor to get all the heat from that vapor to kind of stick together. Bear with me here for a moment, okay? So when the vapor comes out of the compressor, it comes out at like 160 to 170, 170 to 180 degrees. It's very, very hot. So what do you need to do with it? Well, in order to turn that refrigerant back into a liquid, we got to get rid of that heat. So what happens is that refrigerant goes to the condenser, which is outside on the roof. There's fans on that condenser that's blowing, just like the fans on the evaporator coil. But what those fans are doing is it's blowing ambient air through the coil, the condenser coil, to disperse that the hot air from the gas into the atmosphere. So if the hot gas that's coming out of the compressor is 180 or 190 degrees, when it goes into the condenser, even if it's the summertime somewhere and it's 95 degrees outside, 95 degrees is still cooler than 190 degrees, correct? So that's what it's doing is it's blowing that cooler air, if you will, through that hot gas and sending that heat out into the atmosphere. And when that hot gas from the compressor cools down, it turns back into a liquid, and then the cycle starts all over again. Okay? Now, how does the evaporator coil in the walk-in box, how does it get the cold refrigerant? Well, at the bottom of the slide, there's something called an expansion valve. And that expansion valve on a regular thermostatic expansion valve, it's got a bulb with a line to it that is in the evaporator coil. And when that bulb gets hot, when the evaporator coil and the inside of the walk-in box gets hot, it sends a signal down to the expansion valve and it says, hey man, it's getting hot in here. We need more of that cold refrigerant to get the heat out. So what happens is that expansion valve opens up just enough to send a little bit of refrigerant into the evaporator coil, and then it closes down right away. And the reason it only sends a little bit in, it only wants to send enough refrigerant into the evaporator coil to make sure that all the refrigerant burns off or boils off and becomes a vapor. Because if too much liquid refrigerant gets into the evaporator coil and it all doesn't burn off or boil off, then some of that liquid refrigerant will head to the compressor, and then what's going to happen? The compressor is going to break down because it can't compress liquid. Okay, so that expansion valve only opens up just a little bit to allow just a certain amount of refrigerant in. It goes to the evaporator coil, and then it does its job. So that's kind of the refrigeration cycle. So remember, you're taking heat out, you're not putting cold in, and you're moving the heat from inside the walk-in box outside to the condenser coil and then into the atmosphere. Okay. All right. Well, let's talk. I've got two things here. I think I can get you done in about 10 minutes. One thing that RDT invented back in the early 2000s was our EcoCool system. And basically, if you're looking at this scenario here, you've got 7 walk-in boxes, 2 freezers, a couple prep tables, a roll-in freezer, and a frost top. Well, obviously, you're going to remote the refrigeration to the walk-in boxes. But for argument's sake, let's say you're going to remote the refrigeration to the prep tables, a roll-in freezer, and a frost top as well. They're not going to be self-contained. Typically, what you would have to do is have 14 individual systems feeding all of this area, or you would have a big rack system that has 14 compressors on it feeding this area, okay? Well, a new compressor came into the food service marketplace back in the late 90s, and it's called a digital scroll compressor. And the difference between a digital scroll compressor and a standard scroll compressor is this. A digital scroll compressor modulates. It can run at 100% of load, 50% of load, or 10% of load. A standard compressor, a scroll compressor, and the same thing with hermetics and semi-hermetics, are either on or off. There's nothing in between. And let me explain. If you take a standard scroll compressor and hook it up to a walk-in box, the installer sets the thermostat at 40 degrees because that's the temperature you want the walk-in box to be. What happens is once the walk-in cooler gets up to 46 degrees, the compressor kicks on, it runs like crazy down to 34 degrees, but it averages 40 degrees. So you always have these 12-degree swings inside of a walk-in box. And that's because the compressor is either on or off. There's nothing in between. With a digital scroll compressor, it modulates. It can run at full capacity or half capacity or quarter capacity. But let me explain it a little bit better. So what I'm getting at here is on the coolers, you've got 7 coolers, 2 prep tables. So that would be 9 compressors you would need altogether to take care of the medium temp systems in this scenario. Well, instead of using 9 medium temp compressors, you would use 1 digital scroll medium temp compressor to take care of all of them. And the way it works is this. Once you run your liquid and suction line out and hook up all the evaporator coils on the coolers and the prep tables, and you turn on the digital scroll compressor, the digital scroll compressor is going to go up to 100% capacity. It's going to run like crazy to bring all of these coolers and prep tables down to temperature. And let's say you set the temperature at 40 degrees. Once it gets a temperature of 40 degrees, instead of running at 100% capacity, it's going to modulate down and maybe run at like 40% of capacity or 30%, because the temperatures are being held. It doesn't need to put any more refrigerant into the system. There's enough refrigerant in the system right now to keep it where it needs to go. But as soon as the chefs come in the morning and start opening up all those doors and the hot air rushes in, that digital scroll compressor now, instead of running at like 25% of capacity or 30% of capacity, is now going to go back up to 100% of capacity because all the doors are open and all this hot air is coming in. So if you didn't have a compressor that could modulate to the needs of the walk-in boxes properly, you would not be able to use one compressor to feed numerous areas like 7 coolers and a couple prep tables, okay? But because of this new digital scroll compressor and the way it works, instead of using 9 compressors to do this work, you can use one compressor. Now, what happens if that one compressor breaks down? Well, we give you a backup compressor that gives you 100% redundancy. So if the first compressor breaks down and the temperatures go up and you call your service guy comes out, opens up the system, he turns off the compressor that's broken down, he opens up the valves to the backup compressor, that backup compressor kicks on and keeps everything flowing until he fixes the first compressor. Let's say that first compressor is broken, he can't fix it, he's got to replace it, and he's got to take it out, put it on his truck, go get a new one, bring it back, blah, blah, blah. That could take hours. With a standard system, you'd be down for hours. But with a system like this, you got a backup that's keeping you going until he gets it fixed. Heck, even gonna go take a coffee break if he wanted to. Now, there's 2 ways to turn the backup compressor on. The first way is the way I just told you, manually. You would call your installer or your service guy. He would come out and manually turn it on. The second way would be automatic. We could set up the system so if the first compressor broke down, the second compressor would automatically turn on and wouldn't skip a beat. Everything would just keep flowing the way it should. Well, that's great, but how do we know that that first compressor broke down? If the second one kicks on automatically, what's going to tell us that that happened? Well, what we would do is we would build in a system where you would put a unit in a manager's office somewhere that has a strobe light and an alarm on it. And when you walked into the office, if that strobe light and the alarm were sounding and the light was flashing, you knew that the main compressor broke down, the second compressor kicked on, and now you need to call your service guy to get him out there to, to get the system working again, to see what's going on with the first compressor. He needs to replace it, whatever the case might be. So it can be done either way. You just need to tell us, the way you'd like it to be done. So you would do the same thing on the low temp. All the freezers would have one digital scroll low temp compressor with a backup to give you 100% redundancy. Now, because you're using one compressor to do the work of many compressors, you're going to save at least 48% on your energy bill, and there's going to be a reduction in installation. And let me show you that quickly before we talk about the saving money part. In this particular scenario, you got 7 walk-in boxes. You got like 2 freezers and 5 coolers, okay? On the top part of this slide is the conventional piping, conventional system. That means in that rack in the upper right-hand corner has 7 compressors in it, 5 medium temp compressors and 2 low temp compressors. Each one of those compressors has to get refrigerant to the evaporator coil. How is that done? Through a liquid and suction line. Okay, so there's a line that goes from the compressor to the evaporator coil, and then another line from the evaporator coil back to the compressor. It's what we call a liquid and suction line. Each compressor has to have its own liquid and suction line to go to the individual compressors in all those walk-in boxes. In the bottom part of this slide, that's the EcoCool system where we're only using 2 compressors instead of 7. You have 1 compressor feeding 5 walk-in boxes on the medium side, and you have 1 low temp compressor taking care of those 2 freezers. Well, instead of having 14 lines going from all those compressors, you now only have 4 lines going out, 2 from the medium temp and 2 from the low temp. And the way they attach to the evaporator coil is you're going to send out a trunk line, which is the liquid and suction line, to the evaporator coils. You're going to tee off of the back of the, you're going to tee off the the liquid and suction line into the back of the evaporator coils. And then you're going to put isolation ball valves in there in case you ever have to isolate that particular coil to do some service on it. So you're also going to, what I'm getting at is here, you can see it, it's a reduction in piping and refrigerant. Because now, instead of using 7 compressors with 7 line sets, you're now only using 2 compressors with 2 line sets. So it's going to be about an 80% reduction in copper piping and labor, and about 50% in refrigerant. Because keep in mind, every one of those liquid and suction lines has to have refrigerant in it to go back and forth between the compressor and the evaporator coil. So your installation costs are going to be very low on an EcoCool system. Not only that, but take a look at the two racks here. The EcoCool system will typically have a smaller footprint as well. Hypothetically, that rack up there on the top right-hand corner, you know, that could be 15 feet long by 5 feet wide by 5 feet tall. Whereas the rack on the bottom could be as short as maybe 8 feet, 9 feet by 5 feet by 5 feet, or 4 feet by 5 feet. So the footprint is going to be less, and the weight is going to be less as well. And that's great if you're putting it up on on a roof or whatever. But let's go back and talk about the savings, because you're only using one compressor as opposed to many compressors. Here we go. What we did was we showed this to UL, and we said, UL, we need a third party, you know, a separate company to study this for us and tell us, you know, how much money you're really saving on energy. So UL did that. And I'm not going to go into the specifics because we're running out of time here. But what we found was using one compressor instead of multiple compressors will save you about 48% on your energy bill at 90-degree ambient. And it'll save you about 33% on your energy bill at 110-degree ambient. Okay, well, what does that mean for me? I mean, this is one particular scenario. Okay, what does it mean for me on my job? Well, if you send us a job and you want to know how much money you're going to save, or what the electrical savings is going to be on any particular job, we can actually put together an energy cost comparison sheet for you. And if you want that done, all you need to do is tell us when you send us a request for design and quote. So what we did here in this particular scenario was we designed this job both ways. The conventional way is when each walk-in box has its own compressor and so on. The digital way is the EcoCool way, where you have one compressor doing all the work as opposed to multiple compressors, okay? We know how much energy our systems use. So we're able to tell you that if you go with a conventional system here that's got all these compressors on it, you're going to use about $10,000 a year in electric. Whereas with a digital system where you've only got a couple compressors doing all the work, you're only going to use about $5,000 a year in electric, and you're going to save yourself about $5,000 a year in electrical costs if you go to a digital scroll. We can also show you what the ROI would be if you were buying everything from RDT. In this particular scenario, the conventional system costs about $23,300, but the EcoCool system costs about $28,500. So the EcoCool system was about $5,100 more. But if you're saving $5,100 a year in electrical, do the math, your ROI is about 12 to 13 months, and then you can continue to save money down the road. And if you think about it, if you're buying a rack system for $28,000 and you're saving $5,000 a year, after 7 years, you've paid for your rack. And if we built that rack properly, it's going to last you 12 to 15 years as long as it's properly maintained. So there is an ROI with an EcoCool system. There's no ROI on any other refrigeration system, including our conventional. This conventional system, there's no ROI on that. You know, those energy efficient motors and things, they don't add up to diddly. I mean, they're nice to have, but it's nothing compared to a digital system. Now, that being said, the EcoCool system is not always the most expensive system. When you get into these larger jobs where it would take, you know, maybe 20 or 30, if that 20 to 25 compressors, and now you're going to do it with 2 compressors, that's where your savings is going to be. Then you'll find that the EcoCool system typically is less money than the conventional system, and you'll start saving from day one. If there's any drawback on an EcoCool system, it's this. It's made for the larger jobs. If you were to send me a job that had 2 coolers and 2 freezers on it, I couldn't give you an EcoCool system because there's not enough load on there, meaning that it wouldn't make any sense to use a digital scroll compressor, because a digital scroll would not work properly if it doesn't have a lot of load to handle. Okay, and I'm not going to get into a lot of that, but it just doesn't work. Not only that, but digital scroll compressors are very expensive, so it'd be cost prohibitive. So we would give you a standard system that would have 4 compressors on it, 2 medium temp, 2 low temp. Now, basically the rule of thumb is when we do an EcoCool system, it's 4 items per suction group. So it'd be, 4 or more medium temp items or 4 or more low temp items in order before we could use a digital scroll compressor. That being said, let's say you send me a job that's got 3 walk-ins on it, a couple air screens, a couple under counters and so on, but you only have 1 freezer. What I could do for you is I could give you an EcoCool system for the medium temp and then just give you a standard scroll for the low temp. But at least half of your system would be an EcoCool with a backup, and it would save energy and work that way. But no, I would say 40–50% of what we sell out of RDT are EcoCool systems. The reason that the others aren't is because they're too small. The systems are too small to be an EcoCool. Okay. And by the way, whenever you send us a request for a quote, we always try to build an EcoCool system first. If we can't, then we give you what will work. Okay. And a true EcoCool system is 1 compressor doing all the work with a backup compressor doing, giving you 100% redundancy. What our competitors are doing is they're giving you a parallel system, which means it's got 2 compressors working together to do the same thing. And then they're saying, well, we're only giving you 2 compressors, but it's not the same. Those compressors have to work in parallel with each other properly, and the redundancy on it is maybe 50 or 60%. It's not 100% redundant the way this is. Okay, real quick, let's talk about our EcoSmart on-demand defrost controller. Unlike the EcoCool system, which is pretty much, RDT invented it, and we're still really the only company making that system for now. An on-demand defrost controller is not unique to RDT. These controllers are being used by all my competitors. They're out there. It's called a Smart VAP. Another one is called a Beacon 2 system. There's another one out there. But the one we're using is from a company called Ketatherm. And the way you spell that, it's a capital K, lowercase e, the number 2, and then therm, Key2Therm. You can look them up, Google them, and see what they're all about. We buy it from them, and we have them private label it for us. So what this is all about is coils in a freezer have to be defrosted every so often. And it's because the freezer is -10 degrees. And what happens is when the door opens and all this moist, hot air flows into a freezer, the fans on the evaporator coil are sucking all that moist air up and blowing it right through the coil. And what's happening is that moisture is turning into frost, which eventually turns into ice, and it attaches itself to the coil. Well, if you get too much ice on that coil, it's going to break down, and you're going to have to replace it. So what you want to do is you're going to have to defrost that coil every so often to get the ice off of it. And the way that's done typically is through electric heater wire. There's a heater wire that runs through the evaporator coil that turns on. It gets very hot. It melts all the ice off the coil. That ice turns into water, drips down into a pan, goes through a hose, and then out to a drain somewhere. And you need to do that every so often to make sure that the freezer the evaporator in the freezer is going to do its job. Now, if you were to buy an evaporator coil that didn't have an on-demand defrost controller on it, it would have what they call a time clock. And what that time clock is after the installer is done installing everything and everything is hooked up and ready to go and it's running, he's going to go set that time clock to defrost that coil, whether it needs to or not, about 4 to 6 times a day, because he doesn't know. He doesn't know how often that coil is going to have to be defrosted. You know, down south where it's humid all the time, maybe he's thinking it's going to defrost 3 or 4 times a day. I don't know. So because he doesn't know how often it's going to defrost, he's got to set the timer to go off at least 4 to 6 times a day. The problem with that is most evaporator coils and freezers do not have to be defrosted 4 to 6 times a day. Many times it's 1, maybe 2 at the most in a bad weather, but it could be once a day, maybe once every couple of days. So that's where the on-demand defrost controller comes into play. This controller is built into the evaporator coil, and it's got probes in it And those probes are sending information back to the controller, telling it how cold the coil is getting and whether there's ice building up on it. And for time's sake, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but there's an algorithm built into the controller that when there's enough ice built up on the evaporator coil, the controller shuts down the system, turns on that hot wire in the evaporator coil, melts down the ice, and then turns the system back on again. However, unlike a time clock, it will not defrost that coil again until ice builds back up on it. And that could be a day or two. So what it's going to do is it's saving you money. The dealer net on this is only $230. And the test we've done shows that within 8 months, you're going to save enough electrical by not doing all those defrost cycles that you're going to pay for that $230 within 8 months. And you can continue to save down the road. Okay. But besides it being an on-demand defrost controller, it's also a monitoring system with no monthly charges. So if the end user wants to take a Cat5 or a Cat6 wire, run it from the controller inside the walk-in box out to a router, they can then find the IP address and bring up this piece here, dashboard. Sorry, guys. It'll bring up this dashboard. And in the lower left-hand corner where you see home, next to home is settings. You can go into the settings, and there's a window in there where you can put people's names, cell phone numbers, or email addresses. So should the system or the refrigeration system break down and the temperatures go up, it'll send a signal out to all those people on that list to let them know, hey, the refrigeration broke down. You need to get a service guy out there. Now, let's say this goes to a service guy, a service tech. What the service tech is looking at is real time as to what's going on with the refrigeration. If this was real time, he would see that the room temp is minus 16.5 degrees Fahrenheit. The coil temp is minus 17.2 Fahrenheit, so on and so forth. He can actually manipulate the system from his laptop before he even goes out to do any service work on it. Okay? It holds 30 days of data for HACCP purposes. Now, typically, you can just download it on your computer, but for $30 a year, that would be the only cost, $30 a year per controller. Ketatherm has their own cloud-based system that you can back everything up into the cloud. So you can be anywhere in the world on your phone or laptop, and you could log into the cloud, and you can see exactly what's going on with all your refrigeration systems. The cloud is great if you've got a bunch of walk-in boxes where you've got maybe 10 or 12 of these evaporator coils that have these controllers on there. Instead of going to each one individually, you could go onto the cloud and they would all be listed one right after the other, and you could just go from one to the other to see exactly what's going on with your refrigeration. So this will actually take the place of those monitoring companies out there that are charging these end users hundreds or thousands of dollars a month. The other nice thing about this is it comes in a retrofit kit that can adapt onto any existing evaporator coil on the market right now. And once it's installed, it'll do the same thing. It'll be the monitoring system, and it will also only defrost the evaporator coil when it needs to, not when it's told to. I had a school district out of Kentucky that has 120 walk-in boxes in their school district, and they're paying literally thousands of dollars a month to have them monitored. I gave them a couple of these to try out, and now they're going to buy 120 of these. It's going to cost them $80,000 plus about 10 grand to install them all. But she said spending $90,000 is nothing compared to what she spends yearly for this other monitoring company to monitor all of their walk-ins. It'll take a couple of years to make it up, but after that, she'll start saving a lot of money. So it's a nice item to have, and you don't have to worry about those monthly charges. So that's kind of it, guys. It's kind of a crash course. There's a lot more I could get into, but for time's sake, we've been about 50 minutes now. I didn't want to go crazy, but hopefully I didn't go too fast, and hopefully you got the idea of what refrigeration is, how it works, and what RDT can do for you.
Thanks, Doug. We really appreciate all that information. Quite detailed, and we really appreciate your time. Everyone on the line, we appreciate you guys jumping on. We appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us today. Tomorrow we will have Halton on the line. And don't forget, if you, now I'm new to Facebook, so you have to excuse me for this, but join Eating in the Kitchen, our group. I guess it's called a page, our group page. Simply go on there and request access. Someone within the company will magically do a background check on you and allow you to be in our group. Join us tomorrow again for Halton. Everyone stay safe, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.